Now, before the break, I brought you my interview with the Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles. We spoke about the challenges of funding major defence projects, in particular, whether we'll need to accept more offshore builds to keep a lid on the costs. For more on this, let's bring in a former Army General, Gus McLachlan. Gus, thanks so much for your time. What's your read on this? Do we need to limit the amount of demands for local build?
I think it's an overly simplistic argument, Kieran. We need Australian capacity to add to this global system. Let me just give you an example. In the first 200 days of the war in Ukraine, the Western Alliance supporting Ukraine has fired somewhere between a third and a half of all land-based smart munitions, so Javelin, Stinger, etc. What that means is all of us in the Western Alliance are going to need to build capacity. So in the days, perhaps a few years ago, we were arguing with the Americans about a job in Alabama to make a missile, therefore we had to buy it off the shelf. I think we're going to need a missile made in Alabama and in Canberra, for example. So it's going to be a case of what can Australia realistically do in that mix. Now, we won't make joint strike fighters, for example, but I think we probably can make smart missiles.
The Deputy Prime Minister is in Europe right now. I asked him about the capacity of our allies there to come to our support in the region if push comes to shove. He says, he really points to the fact that countries like Germany are upping their defence spend off the back of the Ukraine conflict. What's your read on that? Is there a real shift happening in Europe?
Oh, absolutely, and I think this is one thing that perhaps Putin underestimated. We've got Finland and Sweden, off the neutral bench, but importantly, we've got countries like Germany undertaking to double their defence spending. But that again brings into question, where is this new capacity going to come from? So countries like Germany and Australia, one of our biggest challenges is actually delivering against the shopping list that we've got. I've got an argument that we need, for example, in Australia, an Australian defence prime. Probably the only country in the major developed economies, for example, the Brits have BAE, Americans have a number of companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, etc. Australia has no anchoring capacity for defence industry. We've got great small companies. How do we grow those, and how do we have a capability big enough to build across this range of areas, or we're not going to meet the demand?
This strategic review, one of the things that you've already touched on that they're looking at is try to get the best bang for our buck. And I've been reading lately talk around the Army's next generation of infantry fighting vehicle. It's not like they're not due for renewal. We're talking about a 1960s capacity that the Army still uses. But is it relevant to the modern day threat? That's the question that's being asked. Is that what Angus Houston and Stephen Smith will be looking at?
Yeah, very challenging timeline for Sir Angus and Mr Smith to really go over the defence spending plan, and it's everything from these armoured fighting vehicles. There's people talking about us buying strategic bombers. We need long-range missiles, but also the back end of defence, the ICT, the networks, etc., need work. The new government, we know, have a challenge in terms of just how much they can spend on defence, but we have a pretty realistic view. We talked recently about the Chinese exercise in the aftermath of the Pelosi visit. We've seen the panda bear its fangs, so to speak. So the question is, can everything that defence wants fit in the most likely budget? I think what's going to happen is, and Minister Marles has already signalled, you might have heard him use this term, we're going to become a hedgehog. What he means by that is there's a defence doctrine called anti-access area denial. Make it really hard for countries to approach and harm you. Now, we would argue we're probably not going to do that from Australia, but we have to deploy it up into the region. I think, and I guess declaring my old bias, I think Army still has a role in that, in defending these advanced missile systems. You can't just plonk them in the middle of nowhere, particularly out in the region. But it's a legitimate question to ask, what can our nation afford and what needs to be a priority? So I think things like long-range missiles, cyber capability, integrated air and missile defence to be able to knock down incoming missiles, they're going to all be weighed up in light of the possible spend on Army armoured vehicles.
One of the things that the government has been talking about as well, about that strategy and pushing out as far as possible to keep any potential adversaries at bay, is the submarine project. The Deputy Prime Minister's in the UK now inspecting their capacity. He says they're still on schedule. It's going to be tough, though, to get any early capacity in the water, isn't it?
Look, the submarine is the one capability, Kieran, that I think, frankly, our regional competitors are really interested in. Why is that? Because countries like China are net importers of energy. If you can put something like a nuclear submarine up on a narrow maritime choke point, you can really at least flex your muscles and have gravitas in a potential conversation. So we desperately need new submarines. The nuclear choice was the right one because nuclear submarines can sit up there for 3 or 4 months at a time undetected. But it's an enormous gap between now and 2040. It's just not plausible that we can continue to have that kind of gap. So it's no surprise that Mr. Miles is in the UK, and I understand we've been talking, about the Virginia option in America. We need to find the fastest pathway we can to an effective capability. The question is, if there's an interim capability needed, just how do we wedge that into an already stressed defence budget?
Now, just finally on the region, we've seen the Solomons put a ban on any further visits at the moment, or at least a temporary pause on the visits by US Navy to the Solomons. So are you worried about where all that's at in the Pacific? Do you think this government's doing enough to try and rebuild relations in the Pacific?
So I am worried because, we just talked about how would we defend ourselves, and preferably you don't want to do it from here. So that means you need a network of partners who you've got good relationships with and potentially access to those countries. What you don't want is some of your competitors to have access ahead of you. So there is no question we are in a contest. It's not war yet. There's a term that's being used as grey zone conflict. Countries are aggressively manoeuvring to get influence and access in our region, and we need to play with sharp elbows and determination.
And with that diplomacy as well, obviously.
And I think this is where I think we are in a good position with the two quite senior ministers. Minister Wong has got gravitas at the cabinet table. She's out there and active, and Minister Miles. But we're going to need those two working closely together to make sure that we've got the access and the relationships that we need.
Retired General Gus McLachlan, thanks. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks,
Talk to
Kieran.
you soon.